Thanks for queuing up and just presenting today. I'm going to just let you know our plan for the testimony is to really focus your comments to the board, please, and that we will have opportunity for discussion of questions among the board and among the staff at a later date. I want to make sure we get enough time to hear everyone. We've got, looks like 10 or so folks now. So I just want to be mindful of time. If we could keep comments to about 5 minutes or less, it would be great. Vince, I'm going to start with you. Mr. Reedy, welcome.
Hi, my name is Vince Reedy, and you can call me Reedy, that's fine, I don't mind.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. And thank you, Commissioner Stein and members of the committee for hearing us today. I've been up here a number of times before, but I live in southeastern Minnesota. Some of the slides there were slides of my neighbors, those Amish guys with the red triangle on the back. That's where I live, in the scenic byways of southeastern Minnesota near St. Charles. First thing I wanted to say is we really appreciate the thoughtful, detailed, insightful document that's 168 pages. I got it late last week and I read it in its entirety. I'm very, very impressed with it. It's very thorough and I have no criticisms of it. I would like to offer a few improvements, but because it's so detailed and well done, I think that it would take a lot of us a little more time. And if we could have the comment period extended to the end of January, it would go hand in hand with the effort to be an inclusive and transparent type of process. On page 11 of the document there, the one thing that kind of made me stop reading for a moment is there's a reference to in response to community concern regarding the potential air quality impacts. To me, that's a very soft way of stating what is going on. It's not really community concern. I'm holding here, this is an OSHA study on it, and it's called a fact sheet, not a recommendation or a suggestion or anything else. These are facts that are accepted by virtually every medical society and every agency. Part of the way down the first page, they refer to the fact that what we are referring to is a class 1 carcinogen. It causes silicosis and it causes death. And I think we should not refer to it as, or let there be an implication that we are addressing the concerns of a few people, or we're referring to tree huggers or whatever. This is something that's factual that we should address the way we address asbestos or anything else. Our air quality is very important to us, those of us that live there. When they talk about the amount of money spent, $30,000 for a machine, $10,000 to have somebody monitor it, and so on. And along the lines of what I was just saying, be mindful of the fact that treatment of the disease is $500,000 to $800,000 for one person, and they don't wind up with any benefit in the end. So I think we should put it on that playing field, is my opinion. And because I'll keep it brief, there are other things that I could say that other people, I believe, are going to address here today, but the governor has talked about the possibility of the potential being on the table of a complete ban in some parts of the state. And I would like for the toolbox that's available in the 168 pages to guide townships through, to show them the way to achieve a complete ban on the activity. That should be a possibility that's there. I don't think anyone has a right to engage in the activity considering all the ramifications. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vince. Welcome, Mr. Corrigan.
Thank you, Commissioners, members of the committee. My name is Fred Corrigan, Executive Director of the Aggregate and Ready Mix Association, and we have members who mine aggregates and sand across the state, probably in most of the 87 counties. And I will keep this brief. Our members will view these standards from the perspective of current best management practices and permits and raise concerns when the standards question those mining practices. As a number of you mentioned and heard earlier, there's been mining going on in the state for well over a century, but many of the companies have been mining for decades with permits in place that have been successful. And while these standards focus on silica mining, we're going to watch where those things may cross over to question current mining practices. ARM and its members are currently reviewing this draft and will comment as an association and individual companies. And our members would like to ask that we go along with Vince's request for another 15 days with the holiday period, and it's really hard getting folks together in time to make the 13th of January, which I understand is the end of the current comment period. Our members value the environmental process that's in place in Minnesota, and frankly, the value of the permits that are in place, and any threats that this process will represent to the interim use permits or conditional use permits that are in place will be of great concern to our members. Specifically, access to 10-ton roads for legal 10-ton loads. There's been a lot of discussion about the intensity of this business, but there is other industries in the state that have equal or greater intensity of the road system, and we believe that the gas tax and other taxes that are in place support the trunk highway system, and any restriction on those trunk highways should be carefully considered. Air monitoring in transportation corridors, we were concerned that the state stepped up with $75 to do monitoring in Winona in a transportation corridor. As far as we know, that's an unprecedented monitoring outside of a non-attainment area in the state, and we'll be interested, along with other members of the Trucking Association, in seeing whether that precedent goes beyond Winona. Buffers and setbacks, I mentioned about Pat, but I thought he did a good job of describing that. We also talked about the fact that there's many other buffers and setbacks in place around these properties, and that once they all start overlapping, it gets very interesting. There is currently a lot of mining going on in floodplains and in the groundwater, and that's a practice that's been in place for many years, and we think it's been done well, and it's been done completely with permits issued by the state and local governments. During the legislative process, there was some question about whether current hydrogeological studies go far enough. That statement was a huge concern to our members because they spend literally thousands or tens of thousands, or some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars doing those studies. Those studies are complete, and they thought they were doing the best job that was done. If there's question about how that process works, they would be concerned if it impacts the process that they use to gain a permit for that facility. And lastly, current reclamation plans and permits. We have worked with the DNR commissioner for years on that process. We know it works through local government, but over the last decade, the help of the DNR and working through that process and what Heather described as good reclamation practices are pretty much in practice in the mining industry today. So again, we would bring that forward to folks writing the standards and say there are good practices in place, and we should build on those practices rather than change those. Our members support the current regulatory process in Minnesota, and we believe it is a good process, and that states that don't have it as thorough a process are struggling with it. And we are always concerned when we hear Minnesota compared to other states, because we don't think that's a fair comparison. So we would like this document to focus on best practices in Minnesota and not compare us to states that don't have as rigorous a regulatory process. Again, more than 30 days would be helpful. And perhaps at the end of the process, the executive director mentioned that this document will go through some more reviews and some final language. And I just wonder whether we will have another chance to comment on the final document at some point when it's complete. That would be helpful. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Corrigan, and appreciate your comments. Alan Muller is next, and following Alan will be Peter Larson. Following Peter is Jim Rahm.
Is this on?
You're not, let's see.
Red light, that's right.
Okay.
Now you're on.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to note that it's customary and even legally required by statutes and case law in Minnesota that when you have a public meeting, the materials under consideration should be on the table for the public to take a look at. And there isn't a single copy in the room of the made available to the public of the document that we're discussing. And I think it would be very becoming for the EQB to comply with the law in that respect at future meetings. As for what we're talking about here, I offered some extremely critical comments on the first iteration, and I think we're seeing here substantial improvements. And some of the concerns that were expressed previously in public comment have been addressed. Others haven't. For example, a mention was made earlier of the request for a toolbox that would include how a local government might want to go about, could go about, banning frac sand mining. That was requested by any number of commenters in the written public comments that I went through. It was expressed verbally. Now, I haven't seen that in the document. It's possible that I missed it, but I don't think it's there. And I think that's still something that there's great concern about. A couple of comments about the air quality and air monitoring sections of the report, and I'm just going to focus on that because it's something that maybe I know a little bit more about. It's stated on page 26, I think it's page 26, that a bag house, a fabric filter, readily captures 99% of all particulate matter. It's not entirely clear what that statement means, but I think it's clear what it's intended to imply. And if we look at particulate matter by weight, that might be true. But if we look at particulate matter by number of particles or by surface area, it's definitely not true. And it's more than a quibble because the health impacts of particulate matter are largely in proportion to the number of particles in their surface area and their speciation rather than the number of pounds of them that you have. And if we are advising local governments and if we're giving them the impression that the monitoring that's described in this document would protect their constituents from harmful health effects from frac sand mining, that isn't correct. So I think that there's a significant amount of work is needed here. And I'll mention another example. There's talk in here about different particle size fractions, PM10, PM4, PM2.5, ultrafine particles. And sometimes when you get into the details of those discussions, what's meant is not quite as simple as what seems to be meant. But I think people should be entitled to know that the technology generally used and recommended by the MPCA for the monitoring of PM2.5 doesn't capture particles, generally speaking, in the ultrafine range. They're down there below. And so not only are we not describing the health effects accurately, but we're describing monitoring programs that essentially track what's customary in the regulatory world, but wouldn't capture or identify increases in ultrafine particles in the air, and therefore would in effect not to a great extent capture the health effects. And I'm looking at this from the standpoint of someone who's observed festivities in Goodhue County and in the city of Red Wing regarding the regulation of frac sand mining. And I think I have some sense of how local officials, county board members, and so on may take these recommendations. And so it's important that they be phrased in such a way that people understand what they are doing and what they are not doing, and what they're protecting their residents from and what they're not protecting their residents from. And if they're going to count on state agencies for advice on that, they deserve really balanced advice. They deserve to know the difference between a regulatory compliance approach and a health protection approach. Another example is mentioned in here, and I think it's on page 28, of requiring that the diesel engines on a site, or the mobile diesel engines, that 50% of those be in compliance with Tier 3 emission requirements. And that's a very valuable point to bring up, because Tier 3 means a category of diesel engines that's very much cleaner than previous types of engine, and with very substantially reduced health impacts. But one may ask, why only 50% of those engines? Why not all of them on a new facility? So I'm going to pipe down with that. Appreciate your work on this. I think there's more work to be done. I'm happy if it's of value to you to suggest some specific wording to address some of the things that I've talked about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller. Peter Larson, welcome. After Peter will be Jim Rahm. After Jim will be Keith Fossen.
Thank you, Commissioner, members of the subcommittee. I'm Peter Larson. I'm here for the Minnesota Industrial Sand Council. We too want to compliment the staff. I am amazed at the work that they were able to get done between the last draft in October and what they have now. It's quite a document. So I want to make some positive comments, because of course we're here to tell you how this could be improved. So we'll repeat again, we strongly support state agency work to regulate our industry. We think that's important for not only protection of public health and the environment, but confidence in our facilities. We've said that over and over, and repeated it often in the legislature. In fact, I think your document could make more clear that there's a lot of responsibility that state agencies have to do a lot of what's in here. We supported a mandatory category for mines down to 20 acres, which is really unheard of. It's an amazing requirement. I would not frankly think it's right in a certain sort of way, given the type of people who will have to do an EAW, who may not be spending their time and money well. But clearly people want answers, and the best way to do it is an EAW, and bringing it down to 20 acres means there's not going to be anything that's going to slip through the cracks. So we support that. We support the state technical assistance team. And the reason I mention all those things is I'm going to make some comments here, and they aren't intended to be comments that would cause us to get away with anything. It's a matter of process and fairness. We're going to give you some written comments, but we got relatively positive comments from some of our members very quickly. We think this is a lot better. But there was also a couple of comments on the tone of the document that it seems in some ways focused on stopping projects more than helping local governments understand their tools so they regulate these projects well. And having been a former state official, it matters to me, because local government folks are no different than you all. You don't sit in your job thinking about how to stop projects. You think about how you can make them safe, because people of goodwill actually want to spend their money and employ people. So we're going to give you some comments that we think are not as maybe detailed as they should be, that help people regulate without stopping things. I'll just give you an example. The recommendations regarding floodplains. There's a statement in here that the assessment is that actual mining operations is unlikely to cause pollution if properly managed under the standards listed above, and those standards listed above are state standards. But then the recommendation is that you could amend existing local floodplain ordinances to list silica processing, stockpiling, and transloading as prohibited uses. And there is a caveat there: until the PCA determines adequate safeguards are in place and firmly approves them by permit. So that sentence seems to say that you should prohibit it. We're probably going to suggest that conditional use permits, interim use permits are good tools. And if there was a section in here that says you can't construct that project until you get your water permit anyway, that would be, in our mind, the type of thing that would be very helpful for people to really be clear on what you mean. We have an issue with things like encouraging closed piles. Now, sure, you put a pile in a building, you might say, well, that's easier, better, safer. Some businesses can't operate that way, and those businesses have today TCA permits that require dust monitoring, dust measurement, fugitive dust management. It's no less safe. It's more expensive and there's more operational requirements, but it's no less safe. So we're going to make some comments like that that we think are important. And then just my final comment, or I'll make two more. One, regarding a ban. Local governments right now can draw areas of their jurisdiction where things are prohibited. They have that authority now. They have an authority to do short-term moratoriums, but we've decided in Minnesota that short-term moratoriums with no rational basis should only last for a year or two. And so you might want to describe that to folks, but that authority exists right now. Local governments have that authority completely. And finally, and this is a tougher one as you go through the document, but there are requirements here regarding trucking, stockpile, noise, reclamation, air monitoring, flocculants, lighting, diesel engines, as if those are unique to silica sand processes. And we would request that you very carefully look through here and make clear which of these concerns are based on silica sand mining or processing, and which are concerns that state agencies would like local governments to take action on or recommend that they could. There's a picture in here of lighting that might not be pleasing to some people. I can almost assure you that that's not a silica sand operation. And so that will probably be another general comment. And we don't mean to say that state staff in making these recommendations to local government might not have a basis for it. It's just that people are going to pull these out and say, if you're a silica sand operation, you have to comply with this. And we're not the only ones using diesel engines out there, for example. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Mr. Rahm, and then Mr. Fossen, and then Amy Nelson after Mr. Fossen. Mr. Rahm, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee. It's a great opportunity to address some of the issues. First of all, I'd like to compliment the staff on the description of the southeastern Minnesota geology in pages 5 through 10. So it's beautiful, and it would be enough there to have a complete ban just from the description of everything. But I realize politically the reality may be a little bit different. So I live in Lake City, and my family all lives in Lake City, and chances are the impact of silica sand on Lake City is going to be probably from, if it's allowed in the southern part of Goodhue County, going to come across County Road 16 to US Highway 63. And if there's a transloading facility in Wabasha, comes right into Lake City on Highway 63, about a mile of residential, single lane each direction, down to the main intersection in town, and then south along the main street. And if we're talking a minimum of 50 trucks each one way, with some very heavy loads and with some toxic loads, potentially, if the silica dust is an issue here. There is a concern, I guess, in the sense that I'm going to try and I'm working with the Planning and Zoning Committee, who is reviewing their comprehensive plan of Lake City, and I know Lake County, which surrounds Lake City in Wabasha, is also doing their first comprehensive plan. And this toolbox to help us put together some protection for the communities that we live in. We'd like to strengthen, I guess, the description of the air quality standards and the transportation standards, since we're dealing with multi-jurisdictional transportation. I'm assuming that we're not going to have a transloading facility in Lake City. That's always a possibility, I guess, but say that there isn't one and the next one is in Wabasha. The mine is in Goodhue County, comes through township in Goodhue County and then through Lake County and Wabasha, Lake Township and Wabasha County and then into Lake City. At least 3 jurisdictions there on US Highway 63, which is, I realize is somewhat difficult to control the traffic part of it because that's, because it is a US highway. But once it gets into Lake City, it's still a US highway. And the damages to the highway and the street and everything else is an issue. But I think the air quality along that street is really an issue because we're talking about going right through a residential area. And I guess we'd like to see some direction on air quality testing and so on if this comes to pass. And how do we deal with it in the permitting process whatever method we can to, if a permit is issued in Goodhue County that the traffic is going to be coming through Lake City, that we can know about that and we can be involved in the process of some remediation, if nothing else, or how do we go about that? Because obviously this testing that is laid out in here very well is not cheap. But it was also pointed out that, the cost of somebody with silicosis is a lot of money too. And so I guess that's the area that I'd like to see improved upon. If we can't have an all-out ban on it in our beautiful blufflands, then in this area of air, I guess it would be both the air quality and transportation part of it to come up with something that we can recommend to the planning boards how they deal with it in their comprehensive plans to get involved in the process as it happens, so we have some kind of protection along the way.
Thank you, Mr. Rahm.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate your time and testimony. Mr. Fossen, welcome to the board.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Before I get going, it strikes me, my wife, Dr. Nelson, and I have been researching this for over 3 years. We've been in Texas, Arkansas, Wisconsin. My wife has pulled together a dozen research documents, in fact, as we've contributed to some research at the universities. So it's brought us to a reasonable awareness of what's going on. And my number one thing I'd like to say today, we've both been on local planning commissions, township boards, very involved with the Goodhue County government, their mining subcommittee, and with the county commissioners. And I am just amazed at how intelligent this conversation is starting to get. You should have saw 3 years ago trying to sit down with somebody and have an intelligent conversation about this subject. And I watched the presentation today, and everybody involved should be proud. Do I have gaps and omissions and things I think should improve? Absolutely, everybody here does. But just the tone of this conversation has changed so dramatically, and especially in the last 60 days at the state level here with the EQB. There's been a shift, and this shift is definitely in the right direction, in my humble opinion. As we go on and look forward at possible improvements, Senator Matt Schmidt and I met with, and Dr. Nelson met with several citizens last night and talked about this. And one of the things that stuck out is they really like the toolkit approach. They like the idea of how can you help local units of government accomplish whatever they want to accomplish, versus trying to dictate to them. And I know that'll always be an ongoing battle about local control. But I think you've really started to head down the right path with this. And some of the things that we heard from citizens, one was, you might as well go all the way and discuss what's the toolkit to deny versus just how to manage and control. What if we don't think that's the right and proper land use in our community? And I think Wisconsin has been this like test bed for us to observe. We've done a lot of research over there. And I know that's kind of sad in a way that they went through a lot of the pains, and then we get to see what went wrong and we get to build upon that. But I think that's only smart. And I think giving a community the ability to decide if we don't think that's a proper land use. Pepin County, you've heard from Bill Mavety before, got to know him quite well, very intelligent man, very well researched on the legal aspects of this. And he's really helped us at the local community level in Minnesota get over that hurdle of, do we dare do it? Do we dare implement a moratorium? Do we dare implement restrictions? And do we dare even to discuss that we don't want this land use? And they implemented that in Pepin County. The other thing I'd like you to consider, there's a lot of good ordinances that have been developed quickly in local units of government. My wife, Dr. Nelson, and I have been able to do some training and work with local areas of government. And we know other people that have done the same, like there's people that have teamed up in Florence Township and wrote a great ordinance from a township perspective. We did in Hay Creek. Goodhue County has evolved to a whole new level within the last 30 days. Fillmore County. There's a lot of communities, and I don't want to forget one. And again, what Pepin County did in Wisconsin, I think there's no reason not to go across the border and look at what happened and say, how could that fit our toolkit that we're trying to develop to help local units of government? Because I think that's the key. I can remember on day one, newly elected town supervisor, a lot of discussion about who's for what, and then sitting there and saying, how do we dare do this? We'll get sued. And this toolkit you're putting together has really helped build our confidence. And I'd like to thank you for that. Another thing I'd like you to consider, I haven't seen in the document, and it may be that I missed it, is underground. We're hearing a lot of discussion in bluff country that you can't mine the bluffs. In Goodhue County, you can't mine in the floodplain, and you can't mine within 1,000 feet of a public waterway. Those are recent restrictions that have happened in Goodhue County. So now I'm hearing a lot of discussion where landowners have had discussions with potential interest of underground. How do I go into the back side of that bluff from a piece of land that isn't restricted and get underground? So I would recommend that discussion starts up in this group of how could you help local townships deal with underground mining, because I don't think anybody's given that a lot of thought. Those are some of my thoughts. Again, thank you for your time. I've been here several times, and I hope to be here more because my wife and I have chosen this to be a very important subject for Southeast Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Fossey. Dr. Nelson.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I think Keith mentioned this quite a bit, and it becomes this thing that we've been doing this for a long time. We actually started this in March 2011. And I don't think many of us in this room got into this purposefully to say, yes, I'm going to attack this issue. We ended up getting into it because we had to. We didn't have a choice. And for us and for many of our neighbors, it was because a hedge fund purchased a piece of property next to a residential development and then said on the bill of sale, we're going to do a sand pit. Well, it really isn't. You know, I've heard that term a lot, and unfortunately we refer to this as sand, but it's not sand, and we aren't talking about sand. We're not talking about aggregate. We're talking about silica. We're talking about silicosis. So it's very separate, and I don't like it when everybody bunches it all together and says it's all the same because it's all non-metallic. And it's not. It's silica. And so I think we really have to focus on it that way, and that's why I liked what Vince Reddy had to say with that too, because that's what it is about. And it's not transporting sand, it's transporting silica. It's spreading silica on our roads, it's spreading silica in the air. And it's not the little brown beads that they end up with that's the problem, it's the fractured. It's what they break up. So I think that's the focus that we have to think about it when we're looking at this, that we're talking about mining sandstone for silica. And so I just want to put that focus on there for us to make sure we're all thinking about it in that way. As I look at the ordinance, I got to tell you, I'm very pleased, I really am. And I know I nailed it quite hard last time. So I'd like to say I really appreciate it, and I think it's a very good piece of work. I love the format, I think it works very well. I think as a planning official from a township perspective, I think that whole format works really well. There are some things that I would appreciate that were in, and I have sent them in many times, but I think they should be included in this. In the back of this, I see that Winona County's ordinance is mentioned as a reference. I will tell you that Fillmore County's ordinance is excellent. I will tell you that there are pieces of Goodhue counties that are excellent, including they just set a 1 mile setback from residential areas. and a 1 mile setback from the Mississippi, protect our tourism industry. And there's pieces of other ordinances that are in there. And I think one of the things that I would like to note with that is that when you're talking about buffers, for example, I thought one of the things that was in there with the survey was nice, but I know that, for instance, Hay Creek Township didn't get surveyed for what its setbacks are. And so there are places that weren't surveyed with that. And for example, you can end up with setbacks from 1,500 feet from a property line in one county, 1,000 foot in another county, and a mile away from a residence in another county. So I think you really need to look at each of the individual ordinances to see that, or call the people who have those in order to get those. The other thing is, in some of these, is that you have different that have banned mining in certain areas. They've developed overlay districts in some areas. So I think linking to or putting those on the website and saying, these are the ordinances that can help you look at that issue. So if they're looking at a distance from a residence, or they're looking at a distance from a trout stream, for instance, Hay Creek ended up banning all mining next to a trout stream. Here are the ordinances that did that. I think that would be very, very helpful for local ordinances, or local units of government. And lastly, I think there's one piece with the silica and the setback that's important, and the things that should be mentioned, is that Crispin Pierce has done a lot of work in Wisconsin in relationship to this, but yet his work in relationship to dust control and what's happened in Chippewa Falls with upwind and downwind from the mine, and how much of the silica has been in the air, is not found in here. And I think that'd be important to put in. And also the more recent event that happened this summer about why you're trying to set setbacks and why these are important is because silica can be found in the air in high concentrations a mile plus away. And in New Auburn, Wisconsin, there's actually a school who had it in their air filtration system. They have 2 mines in town, a quarter mile away and a mile away, and they have others within 15 miles. So I think the reasons why you're trying to do this and keep it away are important. Not just to mention that there's silicosis, but actually that there's studies done, and then why the townships and why the counties have done what they've done to try to protect. So again, I really do appreciate it, and I think we've done a really good job. I would just appreciate being tightened up a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. And I failed to get the on-deck circle filled here. Don Arnosti and Kristen Eide Tollefson. So Don is up next, then Kristen Eide Tollefson following Don, Jim McElrath and Jody McElrath. Welcome to this committee, Mr. Arnosti.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. My name is Don Arnosti. I represent 13,000 Audubon members across the state, including many in chapters and right in these affected communities in the Paleozoic Plateau and the Minnesota River Valley. As other folks have commented, I think this is a much improved draft. It's like night and day. I'm just going to forget about October, and we're starting from here. This is a very good first draft and a really good effort. I would comment, however, it's been very difficult to review on such short notice in terms of between Friday and today, and my comments are really mine. I've been unable to do the normal consultation with chapters, members, and staff that we ordinarily would do as an organization. And with that in mind, I'd like to point out that not all 30-day comment periods are created equal, and I would very much encourage you to extend the comment period through the end of January, because my ability to get the attention of our members and chapters during these next 2 weeks is just about zero. So realistically, the comment period from the standpoint of ordinary consultation with our membership and chapters really can only begin in January. So a 30-day comment period throughout the month would be appreciated. A general comment I'd like to have is, I think the first 106 pages are really an outstanding toolkit. I'm sure there's specifics, like Mr. Mueller pointed out, which I hadn't thought about in terms of the focus on maybe emerging science on very small particles and the need to really understand that's where the real health hazards come from. There's a lot of tweaks and improvements that can be made, but generally speaking, to my personal review of these areas, it's very valuable to understand really the set of complex issues: air and water quality monitoring, regulation, natural heritage searches and protection, reclamation design, the staging of mine development, reseeding, the importance of the actual materials that you use for revegetating a site, blasting regulations, mine inspections, financial assurance, the regulations, and just good practices in doing that. This is way beyond the ordinary activities of certainly many of the smaller jurisdictions that you're going to be assisting with, townships and even some counties and cities. And I think you need to bear in mind that the reliance on a quality regulatory framework, which is being suggested when the I think it's the fourth section, page 108, where you talk about setbacks and buffers, are not recommended. They're not recommended in favor of a robust regulatory system that is implemented by people who really understand what they're doing. They have the financial resources to follow through on the best practices, to continue to monitor. They have enforcement authority, all of those sorts of things. That's theoretically true. But in terms of reality, in many smaller jurisdictions with part-time staff, volunteer officials, things of that nature, it's not very realistic to expect that that will be well implemented, even with some technical assistance. And the regular routine fallback of such jurisdictions is things like setbacks. So in my review, I think it's inappropriate to be so negative on what is clearly, in many instances, the best available option. It may not be theoretically the best option, but it may be practically the best option, depending on what sort of jurisdiction you're talking about. I would recommend enhancing information on one thing that's not really mentioned in there, which is, as Mr. Larson pointed out, the ability of local jurisdictions to do bans through zoning, to identify areas where mining is not appropriate. And the flip side of that, it's really the other side of the same coin, which is mentioned in there on page 108 and others, is a discussion of mining overlay districts, which is areas where basically it's been determined that mining is appropriate practice. And I think that really should be brought forward as one of the tools in the toolkit, the two of those, because they really are the opposite sides of the same thing. Bring out the fact that there are those tools. It is appropriate. You're not necessarily going to be sued into the ground, to zone and say no mining here. And like I said, the other side, really amplify and expand on how a mining overlay district might work and how that could be implemented. Finally, we're the Audubon Society, and so I want to talk a little bit about our focus, birds, and the habitat in the region. This whole region is the funnel at the top of the Mississippi River Flyway. And when I say the whole region, that includes the Minnesota River Valley, because the distribution of birds using the migratory corridors and the habitats we have along our waterways, they certainly come up the Mississippi River and the adjoining habitat that we're talking about, as well as moving up and down the Minnesota River Valley. The birds and species that are found here is briefly noted in the document, but we're talking about, these are areas of national and continental significance to birds. Very, very significant. The important bird areas identified in an international program line these riverways, and I'm sure the Commissioner Langwehr is well aware of that. Several of the birds that were mentioned, such as the prothonotary warbler, red-shouldered hawk, or the peregrine falcon. This is one of the rare areas of the state where peregrines are found not clinging to nest, artificial nests built on top of buildings. This is actually their native nesting territory, the blufflands and all that. The document notes that there's 156 species of greatest conservation need. I think the figure, it also noted that 41% of the mammals in that category are found in this region. I believe it's roughly the same thing in terms of these species of greatest conservation need. It's the largest single concentration of rare and unusual species that are tied to their habitats, plants, animals, mammals, things of that nature. I feel the recommendeds in the bluffland protection section are too weak. That's the section in 124 through 128. It does talk about the bluffland protection ordinance, which, and it describes what it does, but fundamentally that ordinance and the other information provided in this doesn't really lay out the value of this area to the natural resources, the birds, the rare plants and animals, the habitats that really belong to all of us. They're public resources. And we're asking local officials to recognize continental significance. Many times it's just several orders of magnitude beyond their level of thinking. So I think your document really needs to help them understand that, not just say ask the DNR for natural heritage data search, which is one element and one part of that picture, but to lay out a little bit more about protecting the actual habitat quality upon which many of their economies and the local quality of life is truly based right now in terms of tourism economy, the reason why people live in the area, why many businesses are located there. It's not just single features, it's really the waves of warblers that move up the Mississippi River and these bluffs, and the birders that literally come to the area every month of the year to see a different kind of spectacle that is happening in this region, and that this is really critical. And if they want to protect that, it's not just protecting a single bluff or a single spring. So just to wrap it up, I think we'd like to see a longer comment period, as we mentioned. I think the idea of really pulling out the fact that zoning bans exist and mining overlay districts could be emphasized as the flip side of that, to figure out where to do it and where not to do it. We need stronger protections for the critical bluffland habitats in that area. And I guess I want to mention this new trout stream setback permit that's been identified there. I want to compliment the DNR for really laying, this is a brand new thing. We have no idea how it's going to walk and talk. They've really laid out a good set of criteria that are very comprehensive to say this is the information we need to use to figure out whether we'd be willing to issue a permit or not in this area. I just have to say that the DNR, and no disrespect intended, but the water appropriations permit track record is poor in terms of being able to really understand the integrated effect of these permits to enforce existing permit conditions. And the legislative track record in funding that activity is very poor as well, which explains part of the performance. So we're wary about, it looks good on paper, but will this really function as directed here? And I think it's really critical that it be function. Last thing I want to mention is Mr. Larson mentioned the fact that many times folks sitting in your seat are trying to work with business, trying to work with the folks making investments in our community and trying to build businesses, trying to find a way to yes. I want to assure you that sometimes the right answer is no. And it's very appropriate for you to point out to local units of government and have in your own head that the trade-offs that are being asked for a particular activity versus the public resources at risk, sometimes it's very appropriate to just say this is not the right place, this is not the right way to do it. Thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Arnosti. Kristen.
Yes, thank you. I'm Kristen Ivey-Collison. I live in Florence Township, where I've been planning commissioner, and I also work as a consultant with small local units on comprehensive planning using the DNR's Natural Resource Protection Framework, which is my focus. Basically, my comments are these, that the intensity, focus, and expertise that your agencies have brought to this over the last month or two it shows it's absolutely hands above document. It's a great approach. It's an excellent toolbox and gives state, local government, and project proposers a common set of data and puts even citizens on a firm footing to address these issues together. I think that's one of its really innovative dimensions. It's thorough, I think, on the sensitivity and distinctions in the geography that legislature asked for, and it's an excellent base for technical assistance. I think it also creates efficiency and effectiveness by putting so much information on the table up front about issues that are highly technical and usually require, multiple information requests and EAWs, and it's very hard to get to this level of information in another way. So I think it's a real breakthrough. It creates an enhanced platform then for these working relationships between the EQB, local governments, and project proposers, and also citizens. The inclusion of costs is brilliant. I think it greatly improves the chances that this will be implemented and can be discussed by local governments and project proposers. I'm very pleased to see the inclusion by the Department of Transportation of the scenic byway intrinsic qualities. This is a huge breakthrough because one of the most difficult things we have to deal with at the local level is that it's so hard to get to those social, economic, and quality of life pieces to explain how it's connected to our natural resources. And the intrinsic quality emphasis is another breakthrough, I think. There is something that I think that the document needs to make it more effective tool for local governments. I think it needs a section in the introduction between the background and the explanation of different geographical areas that elaborates the working technical assistance relationship between the state agencies and local governments. In other words, it elaborates those subdivisions 3 and 4 and how those are going to work. It's like, so you've got the bicycle, you need the training wheels, you need the steps so that local governments can actually move into using those tools. There are some specific questions that came up for me as a local government person. How does the technical team work? How to work with the technical team? What are the steps that a local government goes through to avail themselves of the technical assistance process? I like that process flowchart idea. What are the options and pathways for review of a project that may or may not include the technical team? And is assistance available in the form of additional information or clarification on the toolkit without engaging the whole recommendation process? And how does that work? What benefits are there of working together? What benefits are there for both local government and the state? Just a couple more. Where's the contact information for each agency, and preferably the technical assistance team, and which team member goes with which category? How to identify, question, will there be a website to support the use of the local government toolkit? That could be efficient, more efficient than a lot of calls coming in. And will there be any kind of periodic trainings or informational meetings where local units who have this on their horizon can come to just meet the technical team, ask basic questions, and get a better handle on this whole concept of best management practices? I do want to highlight that that has been one of the challenges in local government, is how to get to the question of best management practices. So I think that as this informs that, it really enhances local government's capacity. So my summary is that I've been around EQB for almost 20 years, and this toolkit is one of the very best pieces of work I've seen come out of the EQB agency collaboration. It's precisely on the mark of EQB's mission, purpose, and mandates. And I'm personally very excited about providing this kind of expertise to local governments and creating a new, a working relationship, a direct working relationship between the agency expertise and local governments. 2 thumbs up, I'd give it more if I had more thumbs.
Thank you, Kristen. All right. Jim McElrath.
Yeah, my story and my wife's story is pretty much like Keith and Amy's, and we started exactly the same time. And my wife and I went to the first seminar over in Wisconsin and brought the first toolkit back to Florence Township. Subsequently, I became a supervisor, and my wife was on the planning commission, just like Keith and Amy. And we learned that if we were going to get something done, we'd have to get involved in the local government. And we banned frac sand mining and processing in Florence Township. And being that the supervisors are not attorneys, we have a fear that by banning this, and if we don't have good, strong standards by the state and get support from the state to support the local governments that have banned frac sand mining and processing, that we would create a loophole and for litigation from the sand mine companies against the townships. And it's a fear, and we're not attorneys, so we were smart enough to be afraid of them though. And it's a big issue because they have very deep pockets, and Mr. Larson's a nice man and everything, but when he really likes this document that you made, which is very good, that kind of scares me a little bit too. The only thing I have to offer other than that is I've notified Mr. Supert and Mr. Langbar that I will be willing to sit on your committee if I can be of help to you, because I've had a hell of an education in this sand mine processing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, Joe. Jody.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and board members. Again, my compliments also on your new document. It's really well done. A couple of things that I just wanted to mention, and I will submit these in writing, is that in terms of financial insurance, not every mining company is a good mining company, and I would recommend that in the financial assurance section that a due diligence is suggested for by the local government units to ensure that, look into how many violations they may have had and what their true financial assurance is. Also, in terms of inspections, some violations in their operations, in my estimation, some suggestions of what they can do if there are violations, anything from a cease and desist to revocation of a permit would be a good suggestion so that local governments have the ability and knowledge to know what they can do. The other thing is I do echo Keith Fawson in the underground mining, that there, what things in the standards or guidelines would change if someone is considering underground mining. I didn't see any language to that effect in the document. And then finally, as I understand it, state land can actually be permitted for mining, and I'm not aware of what the local government units could expect in terms of contact, what their expectations should be, should a large piece of state land be permitted for mining or processing. And other than that, extending the review time would be excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McElrath. John Lancheski is the last person I have on the list, and then I know some board members are running tight on schedule, but board members looking for one more sort of response at the end of the conversation here so the public can, people who testify can hear kind of our reaction to this input.
Well, we have a quick minute. I just want to make one correction in the last slide. It indicated that our mailing address was 500 Lafayette Road. That is not the case. Our mailing address is 520 Lafayette Road. So as mentioned earlier, we encourage email, but if you want to use direct mail, make sure you please send it to 520 Lafayette Road.
Mr. Lancheski, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is John Lancheski. I'm with Minnesota Trout Unlimited, and you've probably seen me here before. And our big concern is water quantity, water quality, and the fisheries resources dependent upon them. I just want to say this report is a vast improvement over the previous edition, and we're very thankful for that. Many people have said it, huge amount of work clearly behind this. We're very appreciative. It's a great improvement. Naturally, I'm going to have to say could be a few more improvements. So again, I want to talk about the water resources and the fisheries resources dependent upon that. And my comments are only focused on the Paleozoic plateau, the driftless area. So I just want to be clear on that. I'm not saying anything about how mining should be conducted in the Minnesota River Valley. That's totally apples and oranges. So I'm focused on this world-class trout fishery area and protecting water quantity in that area especially. So I passed out my comments from about a month ago. I'm not sure if members actually saw those, so I wanted to make sure you got those directly. It seems like all those comments are still relevant. There's still gaps in this report. I think pretty much all of those are pointing at a gap in this toolbox that still needs to be filled in a little bit. And so I'm just going to make a couple observations. I'm not going to go through all those, but kind of two big observations. One is I see very few model standards here. I see lots of guidance, perhaps some criteria, but it stops short of providing that sort of tool, namely a model standard or model setback. I think Mr. Arnosti is right that practically speaking, the way most local units of government are the tool they're gonna look to most is, can we set a minimum? Sure, we can go beyond that, but give us some help here. What is a minimum that would be protective of the resource? So there's a discussion, say, on the trout streams, but there's no distance, there's no setback recommended for a local unit of government. Instead, the document talks about the fact that, well, the DNR has a trout stream setback permit. Now, there's an important error in this document that I just wanted to flag. It's on page 131, and it indicates that this permit extends to not just designated trout streams, but also to tributaries of designated trout streams, streams that have the potential that could be designated, Class 2A streams, springs and seeps. That's not correct. None of those are in the trout stream setback permit language in statute 103G. That was what the DNR and Trout Unlimited both supported. DNR very publicly supported a 1 mile flat out ban. Not just on designated trout streams, but perennial tributaries, all springs, Class 2 waters. That's not what is in the statute. It is limited to just designated trout streams. Now we know, the DNR knows, we have roughly a dozen decent trout streams in the Paleozoic Plateau, which are not currently designated. Those are completely unprotected, not covered by the permit. So the gap here, there's an error that should be corrected there, but my concern is that if you read this, the local government's going to think, well, the DNR's got this permitting program, we don't need to worry about it. And that's not quite right, and I think the DNR's clear preference had been flat out banned, let's not monkey with this permit. I think that should be suggested as, here's the model standard, 1 mile minimum. You can do this kind of study between 1 and 2 miles, whatever you want to do, but I think as part of the toolkit, you need to go that one step further and say, here it is. Now, I know there could be concerns that, well, maybe the local unit of government, they could get in trouble with the planning and zoning, and maybe they're not sophisticated, but I think you've cautioned them a lot about, you need to bring in the attorneys here to look at how to do this right from a planning and zoning perspective. You have a technical assistance team. I think one tool they're going to want to know is, well, if we really made this a priority, what should that number be as a minimum? And so I think that's lacking, and the trout stream is just one example. And then sort of my second big observation is just about some items that were completely ignored in this document. And most of those are touched on in my written comments. There's no setback for sinkholes. Think of this as the groundwater recharge areas. Nothing, no discussion about that. How are we going to protect that valuable natural resource? What about all the springs down there? We just mentioned calcareous fens. And again, I noticed there's no number given for a setback for calcareous fens. The document talks about it, talks about that they have to look at it, but there's no real guidance given to local units of government, and they didn't even look at all the other springs that are not calcareous springs, which is kind of a special classification, and they're mapped out. So another gap there. The big one is the groundwater, a vertical setback from the groundwater table. This is something both Trout Unlimited and the DNR supported in the legislative session. Let's just, the number that was in the legislation was let's say 25 feet above the water table, so we don't mess it up. Now you can quibble about the number, should it be 25, 10, 50, depending on which Sandstone you're in, some would say it should be 50 in other places, and you have to account for annual variation in rainfall, but whatever that number is, the DNR supported 25 feet is kind of a vertical setback above, but at least we should say, as a model standard, local units of government should say, stay out of the water table. But that's not in this document. And again, I think, let them know what would be a good minimum. Again, I think there's just a reliance upon the DNR's groundwater permit appropriation system. It has not been well administered. They have never denied a groundwater appropriation permit in southeastern Minnesota. So again, I'd like to see those standards championed by the DNR. A few months ago, at least be in this report as a target that the local unit of government should shoot for. So I mean, there's a few more. Again, you have my comment letter. Another one would be just sort of a criterion about groundwater quantity that they could use. Say for the do we want them wasting our groundwater to sort sand and use it for mechanical features, or should we make sure they're kind of steered towards surface water for that purpose? So again, that was that criterion in legislation was a cap of 1 million gallons per year for mining or processing. Again, I think that's a good standard. I'd like to see it in this report as well. So, sort of in summary, I think you need to give that next piece of the toolkit. I think you've already cautioned people that they should get legal advice about how to do this in a planning and zoning situation. And you've mentioned you got a technical team to help them see if it should be bigger, perhaps. But I think you need to get them a number to start with. So again, this is a great improvement. I think we've got to go a little bit further, and I think the improvements will really give some greater certainty to businesses and these local planners. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Winchevsky. That's all the comments that we're prepared to take in the last 7 minutes. Board members' reactions or comments or thoughts for the public and persons who are attending today. Commissioner Lambert.
No, just a couple of things. I want to thank everybody who came here today. I know many of you had to travel ways, and I appreciate your continuing to come and participate in this process. I know staff, and I appreciate your compliments to staff as well, because I think they did a good job, even though we had times when we debated vigorously back and forth about which way it ought to go. One of the fine lines we had to walk, of course, is that we want to provide model standards that have some basis and don't put local units of government in a position of being successfully litigated against. We want to make sure that there's something that they can stand on, that they don't have to worry about. If you're Forest Township or you're Hay Creek Township, you don't want to take something the state advises as a model standard and then find yourself in court because it's not defensible. So I think there may be some caution on part of staff in putting some recommendations in the document to that effect, and I support that, because I don't think we want to invite litigation or cause local units to pause in accepting these because they're afraid of litigation. But having said that, many of the things that are in here are going to require that they get legal assistance. We, the EQB, the Technical Advisory Team, is not going to be able to provide legal assistance, and so implementation of any of these ordinances is going to require some legal counsel. The two thoughts with respect to content. One is that I think Don Arnosti raised a point that science is improving daily, and so our thoughts on standards and criteria may change, rather rapidly over time. I think we ought to compel ourselves periodically, whether it's annually or biannually, to look at the science that's been accumulated, look at some of the things that have been done locally, and consider revisions to the document, so that don't just put it on the shelf and leave it there without revisions. Let us be deliberate now in thinking about how to update the document with new science. And the second is that there was a question about what might happen on public lands, and I just want to say, from a state standpoint, I can think of at least four types of public land: state forest, wildlife management area, aquatic management area, and state park. Scientific and natural would be another. None of those would fundamentally allow the mining of silica sand. They have statutory purposes for which they were created, and those statutory purposes would pretty much preclude the use of those areas as silica sand. So, two things I want to say about that. One is that, you can rest assured that those lands are going to be open for mining, but also in the toolbox, we may think that, one of the tools that can be applied is if there's an opportunity for public ownership. It doesn't need to be the state, it can be the county or the federal government. It may be a tool that can be used to, protect areas from mining that people may not want to see mined. And the other type of land, state land that I'll mention is school trust lands. School trust lands, by definition, are intended to generate revenue for the school trust fund. There are some small parcels of school trust land in southeast Minnesota, but our belief is that they're so small that they're not going to be practical from the standpoint of silica sand mining, and the department's going to be working to move those out of school trust fund status over time.
Commissioner Ellinger.
I really appreciate the work that all of the technical staff have done on putting this together, and also the input that the community in general has with that. So I think I've learned a lot just in the conversations, and I like the idea that we are getting new science, new information that we need to review. And so I think over the next month, looking at all of this information will really allow us to come up with some good recommendations.
Well, I guess I would just say again to thank the team for what they've done here, and then I want to thank the people who came, the public input, which was so constructive, and it's the discussion and criticism. Very helpful.
Mr. Seufert, just maybe walk us through kind of the next steps in the process and where this leads us, and any other comments that you'd like to make to help clarify the wrapping up.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In terms of process, we had, I don't have the schedule right in front of me, but we had originally set a 30-day comment period to end 30 days from this last Friday, and then had baked a couple weeks into the process to make revisions based on the comments received, with the intent of approving this at the February 19th board meeting. And so, we will talk with technical staff and see if we can amend the date with the comment period and still meet our February target. So we will notify folks about that decision as soon as possible.
Great. Just by way of having responsibility to chair today, I appreciate the tone and commentary of the meeting. Also know from the body of work that I've seen in my career as working across 3 state agencies, this is very impressive. I think it is important for local government to know that the agencies work collaboratively. It's always been that way, but it doesn't always show up in the documentation. This is really appearing in documentation, and so kudos to all of you who put that together. I know it's not easy to blend your voices in one document and agree to edits from each other periodically. That can be a little tense, so thank you for that. I know it's hard work, but it is the right thing to do. Our meeting, we're out of time, and I don't think we'll hold for a motion. We'll just declare the meeting adjourned.